You may be seated. I'm surprised so many are here after dodging lightning bolts all night. It was quite a rough night. I want to open by saying I love education. By my mid-20s, I'd completed a science degree when I'd gone to Bible school. In my late 40s, I decided to go back to the academy. And since then, I've earned 3 degrees, one in philosophy, one in early Christian history, and a PhD in theology. About 2 years ago, I looked at Gail. I said, hey, babe, there's this graduate degree in world religion that I would love to get from Harvard University. She did not break out into immediate applause. But eventually, she gave me the administrative leave of absence that I needed to go. So I graduated in a couple of weeks. And I called Father Paul up earlier this month, and I said, hey, I need to complete a public forward project for one of my final classes. Would you be okay if I preached on my project on Sunday morning, on a Sunday morning? He's kindly agreed. So I usually come to the pulpit with an attitude of altruism and where I only seek the best for you. But this morning, I'm using you to cop a grade. So let us begin. I want to focus on verse 9 of our gospel text where Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God." The whole concept of peace in our lives leads us to the hope that things can be okay between us and others. Peace is that space where everything is appropriate. This is more than the absence of conflict. When things are right and when things are appropriate, our life flourishes from the interactions that we have with other people. Peace is a kind of social fitness where relationships work in our lives across family, friends, community, and with the peoples of the world. God wants peace in our world. In our liturgy, week in and week out, before the Eucharistic prayer, we speak peace to one another. This is our verbal commitment to ensuring things are well, that things are appropriate between us, which according to Jesus gives evidence that we are the children of God. The problem is peace is not all that easy to secure and to maintain. It's notoriously difficult because we're so different from each other. Psychologists Kersey and Bates write, quote, "People are different in fundamental ways. They want different things. They have different motives, purposes, aims, values, needs, drives, impulses, urges. Nothing is more fundamental than that. They believe differently. They think, cognize, conceptualize, perceive, understand, comprehend, and cogitate differently. Differences abound and are not at all difficult to see. It is precisely these variations in behavior and attitude that trigger in each of us a common response. Seeing others around us as differing from us, we conclude that these differences in individual behavior are but temporary manifestations of madness, badness, stupidity, or sickness. In other words, we rather naturally account for the variations in the behavior of others in terms of flaw and affliction. Our job, at least for those near us, would seem to be to correct these flaws. Our project then is to make all those near us just like us." End quote. Making others like us is not the peace building Jesus is speaking of. So much peace gets lost over the concept of who is right. Me being right makes you wrong. If I'm right, that makes me good, and you not so good. You bad. This gets even more dangerous if my right is based on a revelation from God. I mean, having a cosmic right gives my right lots of might. It makes you, or makes me the wise one, and makes you, the one who disagrees with me, the fool. When someone is seen as a fool in your mind, we instantly begin to dehumanize them. Here's a familiar verse to most of us. This is Matthew 5. The laws of Moses said, Jesus is speaking, you shall not commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust in his eye has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus is simply saying that lust unchecked always leads to adultery. But he says something very similar just a few verses earlier. This is in Matthew 5 again. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in the danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council. Raka literally means you vain, empty, worthless fool. But whoever says, you fool, shall be in danger of hell fire. Jesus is saying that just like adultery begins in the heart, murder begins in the heart. And it begins with seeing another person as a fool. Labeling somebody a fool is a form of murder. And it releases hellfire, which is another way of saying violence in the situation. This is so dangerous. It makes us ask the question, is there anyone you think of as a fool? Maybe a person you work with? Maybe people of a different faith? Maybe those who are part of an opposing political party? Who do you think of as a fool? If there are people you think of as fools, then a bit of violence, a bit of hellfire is already erupting in you. Maybe it's just the violence of ignoring them, or the violence of gossiping about them, or the violence of going after them in social media, some form of violence. Unchecked, you'll find yourself thinking like James and John in the Gospel of Luke when they ran into some people they just didn't agree with and felt needed to be corrected. And it says in the text, and as they went, they entered a village of the Samaritans to prepare for Jesus. But they did not receive Jesus because his face was set for the journey to Jerusalem. And when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume these people just like Elijah did? And Jesus turned and rebuked them. He says, you do not know what manner of spirit you are of. Just because you think you're right doesn't make you with a right spirit. For the Son of Man did not come to destroy people's lives, but to save them. The question is, what spirit do you want to operate under in this world, in your home, on the job, in the community in which you live? The Holy Spirit or the spirit of hellfire? When hellfire spirit gets into the church, you end up with these horrible, inexcusable actions. We look historically, one classic example is the Inquisition. The Inquisition in the 1100s, Christian leaders justified using torture to keep heretics from gaining influence in the church and in hope that they might be saved by losing and renouncing their silly ideas, their stupid, foolish ideas. And these leaders used iron collars with spikes on them to impale the throats of those who opposed them doctrinally, as well as stretching machines that tore those fools apart in the name of God, of course. Church leaders felt justified in their actions because they were ensuring that the Christian doctrine remained pure. Saint Dominic, who ironically is the patron saint of innocence, claimed or wrote to a group that were about to be tortured by the church. He said to them, quote, "For many years I have exhorted you in vain with gentleness, preaching, prayer, weeping, but where blessing can accomplish nothing, blows may avail." End quote. This idea of the wise being able to do what they want when dealing with fools rose to a whole new level in the period of Western history referred to as the Age of Discovery, where explorers like Columbus, went out to discover the world, something ugly gets into the Western social, political imagination in that Western, or that historical moment, which is seen quite sharply in Columbus's discovery of the New World. Here, European explorers discovered people that they couldn't figure out. They couldn't recognize them, and they had no category for them. So here are all these masses of people. Religiously in Europe, there were only Christians and Jews and Muslims. But in the New World, they ran into these people who seemed to have no religious system, no organized practices, no places of worship, at least none that was obvious to them. Philosopher Nelson Maldonado Torres writes that these explorers began to think that the people they encountered were other to man. In other words, less than human. These non-white groups were labeled as those who lacked a soul and were categorized as non-beings who inhabited the zone of non-being. Now keep in mind that these are the explorers that housed their work in the value of preparing the world for the imminent second coming of Christ and the need to take Christianity to all the parts of the world. That's what was driving them. But they just weren't sure the people they ran into were fully human or able to respond to the gospel. I mean, the natives had no discernible wisdom, no evidence of a divine presence. They thought God must not have loved them because they had no prophets, no revelation of any kind of Abrahamic nature. So they started to consider them idolatrous fools. And they became markers of a subhumanity. Maldonado Torres calls the crisis, this a crisis moment in Western history of how to understand others that are different than you and how it became a major historical and epistemological event. And the ethics got real muddy. The new lands with these non-beings, it wasn't a context where law and ethics had grounding. And by this reasoning, the colonizing dominators decided they could do anything they wanted, which led to genocides, massive racial slavery, multiple forms of segregation, and complete control, because the wise always have to rule over the fools. These people became more cattle than freemen, more bug than carrying any inalienable rights. Remember, these explorers were brothers and sisters who claimed to be in Christ. Their approach became the blueprint for what we see across the world from Europe of modern colonization. Let me give you one snapshot from a report from the U.S. National Commission on Causes and Prevention of Violence that was commissioned by President Lyndon Johnson in 1968. Quote, in 1636, 16 years after establishing Plymouth Colony, the Massachusetts Bay Puritans, these are the religious ones, entirely without provocation, set out and massacred an entire Pequot village. These are Native Americans. The Plymouth governor wrote about this, quote, it was a fearful sight to see them frying in the fire, but the victory seemed a sweet sacrifice, and we gave praise thereof to God, end quote. It's easy to kill fools. Peace-building advocate Atelia Omer writes that religious people often participate in violence and they're not even really being aware they're doing it because they're so focused on being right. Sometimes we get so focused on being right, we don't really think about what we're doing. Harvard professor Diane Moore writes that we must come to grips with how religions have functioned throughout human history, sometimes to inspire, other times to justify a full range from the heinous to the heroic. We have to own this as people of faith. We have to be aware of its danger. Sadly, there's so much violence in our world, most of us have become tolerant of it, even in our own lives, our personal lives, in our society, online, politically, globally. And instead of moving in the world with peace building, it's so easy to just get mad. The careful research of Johann Galtung shows how violence can show up in a number of complex ways. There's direct violence, systemic violence, and deeply entrenched cultural violence. It's everywhere. Hence, being a peacemaker requires lots of intentionality and lots of careful discernment. So, how does one step into the blessing that Jesus says can be those of the peacemaker? First, to become a peace builder, we have to recognize that many of us want to run from conflict, not toward it. We want to recuse ourselves. We want to get quiet when arguments start. We want to go offline when Facebook flares up. We equate peace with the absence of engagement, but that is not peacemaking. Peacemaking demands more risk than that. And leaning into uncomfortable spaces expands us somehow if we hold our tongue and open our ears. And somehow we become the blessed because we become the peacemakers. We must choose to be in the fray of peacemaking if we're going to be peacemakers or peacekeepers. In his book, The Phenomenon of the Human Person, Robert Sokolowski describes how we are in something. And he says, quote, "To say I'm still here in this way is a declarative use of the word I. It is neither cognitional, no, it's not just out of the head, nor is it just emotive, not just because you feel it. This usage is often found in religious language when using an existential declarative, in other words, declaring something about my life, right? He says, I do not promise or dedicate myself to any project in particular. I'm just there. I'm just in this for whatever may come and whatever needs to be seen or done. I'm still there, and I declare myself as such, as a data, a person engaged in veracity." What this means is that if you're going to engage in peacemaking, peace building, you just have to keep showing up. You may not know exactly what's to be done. You may not know exactly what it will entail or how long it will take, but you're in. So that's the first thing. Secondly, I have three of them. Secondly, I think to be peacemakers, we must beware of the danger of the single story. There's a text in James 1 that says, "You know this, my beloved brothers and sisters, that everyone must be quick to hear, slow to speak," because we're listening more, and slow to anger, which means you just don't take one side and get mad about it. For a man's anger does not bring about the righteousness of God. Listening should be our first response when we encounter a story of violence, not anger. Hearing one side of a story, one side of a violent act, usually leads to just anger, fixation, and polarization. Edward Said, who works hard in the peace-building space internationally, urges people to, quote, think about the two histories of a violent situation. From both sides of a conflict. He says, think of them together. Hear those stories together. And he says, contrapuntally, which means listen until you hear harmonies. Listen until you hear similarities. Listen until you get what's going on both sides. This is not easy. This is not easy. Anytime there's a conflict, there's always more than one side of the story. The problem is hearing two sides of a conflict confuses us. It's just easier to just hear one side, and then it's like a toddler puzzle. It just goes one place, right? But when you hear more than one story, you experience the worlds colliding, and you get confused. But hearing both sides also helps get to the heart of the matter. John Lederach claims that one can rarely reach the essence of anything by going straight at it, and that the soul of a matter is often best caught when you hear the stories behind the matters. In story, we are witness to something that happened, along with its inconsistencies and contradictions, without closing the subject. You're hearing it. He claims that this is the genius of story. It invites the hearer to participate in what has been shared, and there's always room for more. Said claims that story affords peace builders a way to discern the complexities of conflicts, of a situation where one can examine all the irreconcilabilities and the antinomies that are present, all the ways in which these things are wrestling, but you hear them with more clarity. Listening to both sides of a story brings a soft way forward into a hard world. But there's a problem. Listening to both sides of a conflict often makes you feel like you're being unfaithful to one side or the other. The difficulty here is that we can make one side mad at us just by listening to the other side. But to be a peace builder, we must listen to more than one side. There is nothing unfaithful or disloyal about understanding the other person's history or the foundational narratives that are in the midst of the conflict that we're facing or they're facing. What understanding both sides does is it undergirds your response and engagement in the situation with lots more empathy. And empathy is critical for building peace. So, let me give you a very difficult example of this. Let's talk for a moment about Israel and Palestine. The world is on fire about this right now. So let me be cautious in what I say, and don't throw eggs. It's critical to mention an important caveat right at the start of this little example, this huge example. I'm not suggesting that the stories of the Jews and the stories of the Palestinians are identical. They're not, or even similar in extent and character. They're not. Indeed, as Gilbert Achcar, who is an Arab scholar, argues in his book, The Arabs and the Holocaust, he says, quote, "The Holocaust was clearly, incomparably crueler and bloodier than anything the Palestinians have been through." It's not comparable. The Holocaust has been the ultimate symbol of evil and human criminality, and rightly so. Many have argued it should be held in our global memory as the measuring reference for all crimes against humanity. In the light of such horror, telling the painful Palestinian side of the story can come across to some Jews and to many in the Western world as anti-Semitic or reductive or tasteless or even morally questionable. The Jews have a horrific story that must not be forgotten. It must be retold again and again. It's by far the worst of stories, but it is not the only story. The Palestinians also have a story. To hear their story is not to be anti-Semitic. It's not to be unfaithful to the Jewish people. In fact, it's the only way to begin to discover peace in a seemingly intractable situation. Here's the short version of the Palestinian story. For hundreds and hundreds of years before Jews claimed the land, Palestine was a place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims lived in relative harmony. When the Jewish people moved to Palestine beginning around World War I and after, they had hope of a place of safety. No one can fault them for that. And in the light of the Holocaust, the world was totally for them. They spoke of themselves as a people without a land in a land without a people. The problem was they might have been a people without a land, but the land did have a people. Millions and millions of people were living and working in that land for centuries, for much longer than we have been a United States. The Palestinian story is one of displacement In 1948, an event known to Palestinians as the Nakba, which means catastrophe, happened where some 800,000 Palestinians were hastily and militarily forced off their lands, their farms, their homes, and forced to wander as refugees to sequestered areas that now fill modern Israel, in those areas where the Palestinians are put. The people native to the land were given no citizenship in the new state of Israel and no path to return to their lands except in rare situations. In the 75 years since, the Palestinians have endured much hardship. Much of the anger and the frustration that we see through the violence and on the faces of Palestinians is rooted in this reality. Again, I'm not suggesting these stories are stories of equal violence or equal character. I'm simply suggesting that peacemakers must listen to the pain and the suffering of every side. We must. Peace building for the Christian echoes the cross, the place where Jesus takes on all the pain and all the brokenness of the human condition. We are to take up our cross and follow Jesus, which at least in one way means that we must openly and receptively listen to the wounds and the pains of all involved in conflicts that we encounter. This is what is at the heart of the incarnation. God comes near. When we lean into the stories of pain from all sides, God comes near. This is why peacemakers are the children of God. We must have the patience and the courage to listen to all sides of a conflict and to be aware that there's a deep danger to the single story. And then lastly, peacemakers must carry a moral imagination. John Lederach calls the moral imagination an imaginative source that rests at the heart's core of peacemaking processes. The moral imagination holds the rhythms and the pulse of what is required to build a genuine, constructive change. It hopes for change. This kind of hope heals deep divisions and exposes what is vital and necessary to value peace in a polarized world. We have to embrace the imagination of hope. He sees the moral imagination as embracing the whole web of relationships, one that includes even those perceived as enemies. We embrace them and we listen. He also calls the moral imagination a place where we have a sustained curiosity. We're not corrective, we're just saying, why would you think that? And how did that influence you? And what does that look like if? Where we look for what he calls the unexplored geographies of human interactions. The unexplored geographies of human interactions. A great way to say we hear the stories, we let the pain of them touch us, we refuse to take side, and then we just look for unexplored geographies. We look for new ways of approaching the situation, new possibilities. This echoes Professor Moore's assertion that, quote, there is nothing inevitable about either violence or peace, which means in every situation we can be hopeful for change. Lastly, Lederach claims that the moral imagination must carry the willingness to take a risk. You will be misunderstood. Peacemakers need to step into the unknown without any guarantee of success or even safety if they want to generate peace. The world needs peacemakers right now. By the water coolers at work, in our conversations with family, at dinners, on our posts online, in our political discourse, especially in a season like we're entering into. Let me say this with sadness. A recent PBS NewsHour and NPR poll showed that 1 in 5 Americans, this is recent, it was like a couple of months ago, 1 in 5 Americans think violence is the only way to solve U.S. divisions that are present in our nation. You want to have a scary day? There's a new film out called Civil War. Gail and I went to see that the other day. Scary and too plausible. Again, the world needs peacemakers right now. Blessed are the peacemakers, Jesus said. They, he said, are the sons of God. Amen. Give me an A, Lord.